I think there are two main problems with holding US dollar assets. We have all seen how the US went in together with Europe. They took over Russia's assets and, they're using some of the profits to fund Ukraine right now. I mean, it's their prerogative, but there are consequences to such actions, right?
Right.
A lot of countries out there, especially in the BRICS, China, obviously Russia, it's going to be a cold winter in hell if they're going to go back to US treasuries anytime soon. There's not much incentive. And if you look at China's perspective, why am I lending money to the US government to fund their activities, which is ultimately going to boomerang and contain my own economy? It just doesn't make sense at this point.
Right. Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome into the studio Sean Foo. Now, many of you who follow my channel probably follow his. He's one of the fastest growing channels that really focuses on finances, international trade. I mean, we're talking BRICS, the rise of gold, the crypto. I mean, everything. You're covering it all, Sean. Welcome to the show tonight.
Hey, thanks to be here. Thanks for inviting me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sean, I know you're in Singapore and I want to get your insights, from that part of the world because, as someone that studies, economics and is an active trader, someone that's investing all the time, well, I want to know your opinion on the trade war and how Trump's tariff policy is going.
Well, I think the trade war has always been brewing for the last 3 to 4 years. It was just that Joe Biden didn't really have the gumption to go ahead with it. There was a lot of, problems with Ukraine and Israel back then. But right now, we're seeing Trump try to shift the US more towards a protectionist policy. However, he's doing too many things at once, right? We can see him, together with Elon Musk, is cutting down a lot of federal workers to Doge.
Yeah.
And now he's pursuing another trade policy on the world with his global tariff war. And to most economists out there, investors, traders, we all know what a tariff means, right? Most of the time, it's not the exporters who pay it. Most of the time, it's the importers paying it, and it gets filtered down to the consumers. There are some arguments that, yes, the exporters might eat a bit, but the majority of the hit will be on Americans. And this is something that we need to consider, Cyrus. I think you have heard of the meme, not really the meme, a fact that 80% of stuff in Walmart is made in China. To some degree, more or less. And it's going to be impossible for the US supply chain to suddenly conjure up factories out of thin air tomorrow to replace the demand and the supply coming from China. So in the end, the US consumer will have to eat the tariffs. So this is not good for inflation and it's not good for the US consumers, obviously.
Yeah, I know that's a great answer. What's interesting, Sean, is I speaking to a lot of Americans here. It's amazing how many people don't understand what a tariff actually is. I mean, essentially, a tariff is a tax. And I was given an analogy to a group of friends here, and they had said, this is great. Trump is making America great again. We're really going to stick it to China and go through with these tariffs. And I said, well, China doesn't pay the tariff, right? If a pair of Nike shoes costs $100 and we have a 20% tariff, that will now be $120. You're paying that extra $20. So it is an interesting, I think it works on paper, right? It's like, ideally we would like to encourage you not to buy the Chinese built Nikes and you buy shoes that are made in America, but there's very few shoes that are made in America. So, what is Nike going to do? Are they going to relocate their factories here after building, their massive supply chain all over Asia? Right. The answer to that obviously is no. So it's an interesting one about this. I want to switch to the US dollar. And this is an interesting thing. I think you made a recent video talking about how a lot of countries are dumping US dollar. They're not wanting to hold. They're actually selling this US debt. What's going on right now in the markets, and especially these countries as they're dumping dollars and not wanting to hold that debt anymore?
Sure. I think there's two main problems with holding US dollar assets, right? Especially when it comes to debt. Now, the first most pressing one is definitely the sanctions. We have all seen how the US went in together with Europe. They took over Russia's assets and, they're using some of the profits to fund Ukraine right now. I mean, it's their prerogative, but there are consequences to such actions, right?
Right.
A lot of countries out there, especially in the BRICS, China, obviously Russia, it's going to be a cold winter in hell if they're going to go back to US treasuries anytime soon. There's not much incentive. And if you look at China's perspective, why am I lending money to the US government to fund their activities, which is ultimately going to boomerang and contain my own economy? It just doesn't make sense at this point.
Right.
So that is the factor of the sanctions that we really need to appreciate. And we have seen a lot of threats from Trump. Thankfully, he has not done it yet. A 100% tariff on BRICS trying to de-dollarize, right?
Right.
There's a point between acting crazy all the time and, posturing, but this kind of things, it feeds into the mindset of leaders all around the world. And that is just on the tariff side. Now, consider the fiscal situation of the United States. It's not really that great to hold US Treasury bonds as well. I think a recent survey just came out of US consumers expecting inflation for the next 5 to 10 years to stay at 3.5%. Now, that's a far cry from what Powell is promising us, right? He's going to bring us back to the land of milk and honey of 2%, right? But it's not going. People on the ground, and I'm sure you can understand that when you go around, the Walmart, prices are slowly elevating up despite what's going on. And because of this, we are going to reach a world where interest rates could keep going higher and higher and higher. So Cyrus, why would you buy a 10-year treasury bond today yielding 4% when there's a very good chance in the next 12 months or 2 years, your yield will be 6%. So you hold off. You don't want to buy it. And that actually raises the debt burden even higher. So it all comes down to the point that Trump, he's trying to maneuver the US economy, bring production back, which I understand, if I were American, I also want some parts of it to be back. But it's just playing with too many moving parts at the same time.
Very good insight there, Sean. And it's interesting. I have a list here of how China's government has actually reacted, because obviously there's always kind of a tit for tat movement, I believe, between the U.S. and China. Ironically, it's always the U.S. that usually starts and China retaliates. But because of this additional tariffs, we're looking at, for example, this is China's government putting tariffs on the United States in response to America, but it's basically additional tariffs of 15% on imported coal and liquefied natural gas originating from the U.S. We're seeing an additional 15 on crude oil, agricultural machinery, automobiles, pickup trucks, export controls related to tungsten, beryllium, bismuth, and indium. So we're going to get into these rare earth minerals. And that's where I want to shift our next focus on, is the rare earths. And I think this is a very interesting one, because China, for those of you that don't know, they produce the vast majority of the rare earth minerals. And it's not so much the mining of that, it's actually the processing. So, even if, for example, there's a lot of talk with Ukraine right now, right? Ukraine actually has a lot of these minerals as well. Donald Trump, of course, is trying to do a deal with Zelensky, saying, hey, 50% of the profits that you're going to get from the future mining, you need to give back to the United States. We want those rights. But even if you get that, even if you had the raw material, how are you going to process that? And honestly, it's China, the one that leads the world in this processing, controlling about 70% of that market. Right. Tell us a little bit about this. This is an interesting thing, with China and their dominance in the rare earth.
Now, moving back to the trade war, this is where we can actually get a deeper insight into it as well. So how the US fights the trade war is mainly with financial sanctions and tariffs, but China takes control of the supply chain, right? They can use the amount of resources they have, the decades and the trillions of dollars they spend to build up all these supply chains to really put the squeeze on the US. I think we can all go back 2 decades, 10, 20 years ago. China, they rolled out the BRI, right, the Belt Road Initiative, and a big part of it was to go to other places in the world, Africa, Latin America, these countries that were generally quite abandoned by the collective West, so as to speak, right? They don't want to send their money in there. So even while China was developing their economies, they decided to have a foothold in these economies, right? You can call it altruistic, you can call it pragmatic, but the fact is, they are there, they're building roads, they're building power plants, they are building mines, and they're harvesting a lot of minerals for both the domestic economy and for China's own supply chain as well. So now China has gone up the value chain, at least in these minerals, they're processing it as well. So all the expertise is there, as you correctly pointed out. Even if Trump gets his vaunted deal with Ukraine for $500 billion, 50%, where are you going to process it, right? It still has to go to China. Now, are there some other production plants elsewhere in the world? In the US, I don't doubt it. I'm sure there are a few. In Europe, definitely. But what is the cost of production? What is the cost of refining over there? If I can get something done in China for, say, arbitrary number, $10 a kilogram, right? But then if I were to do it in America for $30 a kilogram, $30 a pound, it's going to jack up my costs even higher. And this is what I really fear a bit for the US economy going forward, especially when it comes to all this protectionist measure. I believe that, you can reshore industries back to the US. However, a lot of the people there, they'll be paying for the extra inflation. And if your cost basis goes up too high, how are you going to compete with other countries especially China, where they want to export their stuff out. So this is something that is a little concerning, to be frank.
Yeah. No, I love those insights. That's really good. And, I think you've hit on a really good topic here is the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this is an interesting thing. You and I have both made a lot of videos on BRI and certainly BRICS as well. We'll continue to talk about those. But, specifically BRI, I think is interesting because it's been around for over a decade. We've seen over 150 countries around the world sign up to this. We've even seen European country like Italy who signed up. They actually withdrew from it and then they went back to it.
Right.
Which was quite an interesting development last year. And I really want to get your sense. You're based in Singapore. You're obviously they're in Asia and there's a lot of development, for example, Malaysia, a very big beneficiary of that. But I think Singapore has some amazing, relationship with China, a lot of trading, a lot of deals with China. What is tell us a little bit more about BRI specifically. And in your opinion, as a Singaporean, when you're looking at China making all of these moves through Southeast Asia and expanding, do you feel that that's a force for good? Are people benefiting from BRI?
Yeah, I think that's a force for good, right? Anytime when you go in and you try to develop a country, especially when they are, third world, second world, and you try to push them up, I think that's a net positive for any country out there. Well, China wants something out of it, of course, right? No country goes around and just gives money willy-nilly, asking nothing for return. So especially in Singapore, we have a lot of positive benefits from China. Just look at our tourism. I think there was a big jump in tourism in Singapore. And I kid you not, when I go to all the luxury stores everywhere, I see 80% Chinese.
Right.
And it's really scary. They go around with 2 bags of LV products, Dior, you name it, Hermes. And ultimately, that actually helps our local economy grow. It helps government grow their revenue. It helps build more opportunities for the locals, to service them in certain industries. So I think overall that's good. But more than just Singapore, you can see China going to other places like Malaysia, like Indonesia, going there to help them build up their industries, especially when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to semiconductors. Some of these countries, they're lagging behind a bit because of their lack of expertise.
Right.
And in a shocking twist of fate, right, we can see China's technical expertise has actually surpassed the US in certain aspects as well.
For sure.
So this is a very good kind of knowledge sharing exercise beyond just helping build infrastructure. So I think the BRI is more or less a net positive for good in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. I want to shift. I want to go back to the point that you brought up earlier with BRICS, because I think this is an interesting one. It's worth revisiting here. We're looking at BRICS. Donald Trump has, I know he said 100% tariffs. I thought he actually increased that to potentially, 150% for the BRICS. And it's all about that US dollar, right? He wants to ensure that the US dollar remains the global reserve currency. But what is your opinion, with the way the BRICS organization is, continuing to develop? And this is something that you and I have both covered on both of our channels. And I like to talk about it with another YouTuber, someone that's studying it very clearly, because, just for everybody to recap, what we've seen is, every year the presidency at BRICS rotates. So in 2024, Russia was the president. They host an annual meeting every October where all of the presidents of the BRICS countries come together. They all met in Russia last year. They had a big meeting, and there was a very big addition where they're now introducing partner countries. So not official members, but partner countries. There were 9 countries that came in. Many of them very significant, very fastly developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia. I believe Thailand and Malaysia were a part of that. So again, right there in Southeast Asia. Are we missing something about BRICS? For example, what if I don't think they're trying to create another currency. That was certainly a thought for a while, that they were going to have this new gold-backed currency. I think they have shifted away from that. Is BRICS really going to emerge really as just a trading organization? Are we going to be seeing more currency swap agreements, more deals being bartered just between countries? Tell us your thoughts on BRICS in general.
Sure. I think it's a little bit of both. BRICS started out mainly as a trading bloc, just basically connecting emerging economies together so that they can trade vice versa outside with the West and with the West. But we saw everything supercharged since 2018 when Trump came up with his first round of tariffs, and things just went ballistic from 2022 when Biden decided to, put the US in a situation where it was, or maybe still is today. And because of this, a lot of the BRICS countries, they now have to come together to fulfill both their production and consumption needs. And interestingly enough, right, if you look at just the oil production, oil demand in BRICS, the producers, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UAE, they have enough production to satisfy the entire bloc's demand. So in a sense, they are self-circulating, their self-contained economy as well.
Right.
Now, when we talk about the dollar and why Trump is so desperate to protect it, is that not just on the fringes, on the main trading hub between China and the BRICS, which is honestly where the flows of trade are, right? A lot of trade comes into China and China trades with the rest of the BRICS. We can see now that cross-border trade has effectively crossed 50% in the Chinese currency, the RMB.
Right.
And this wasn't this year. It wasn't even last year. It was 2023, if I'm not wrong.
Right. You're right. That's right.
Yeah. So now we can comfortably expect it to be 55, 60%.
Right.
And this really poses a lot of trouble for Trump, for Scott Bessent, people in the Treasury who wants the circulation of dollars to continue. Because just think about this. If China continues to export more cars to the world, more stuff to the world, and let's say, hypothetically speaking, their semiconductor industry booms next year, and they have this massive lump of chips to share with the world, to export to the world, chances are they're going to invoice in Chinese currency, the yuan, the RMB, instead of the dollar.
Right.
And this is, I think, a clear point that really, threatens and puts quite a bit of fear in the Trump presidency as well. And that's why we are seeing him hammer down relentlessly with all his tariffs.
I've got let's continue this thought, because there's one theory out there with a lot of economists and some people that are studying this, that, for example, China's is overproducing right now. They're actually flooding the market with too many products. That we have invented this term called overcapacity, which is a very interesting one. I'm going to bring up a screenshot here that it's actually an opinion piece on the New York Times. It's entitled "She is Making the World Pay for China's Mistakes." Quite a bold statement, and it's basically what it concludes to is that China's making too many products, and it's not good for the world because they're dominating manufacturing. And I think this is funny, because I think a better way to say that would be, she is helping the world pay less for essential goods. That's essentially what it is. So, talk to me a little bit about the, overcapacity and, what we hear constantly about this, because you just alluded to that, right? What happens if China continues to make more electric vehicles? And by the way, yes, we can't buy Chinese EVs here in North America, right? They're banned in the United States and Canada. But what's very interesting is when you start going around the world, right? You start going to South America, even Europe now, and certainly Southeast Asia. I mean, Chinese automobiles are everywhere. Tell us a little bit more about the myth of overcapacity.
All right, sure. So when it comes to overcapacity, well, there is a glimmer of truth that China is trying to export their way out of a prolonged slump right now. There is some truth to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You sell stuff to the world, you gain dollars, you gain revenue, and it helps your country grow, especially when you want to build up consumption.
Right.
But look at things in the greater picture. China is actually exporting deflation to the world. Because if you look at the Chinese ecosystem, it's truly brutal. I'm sure you've been there. I'm sure you've seen the amount of insane competition, not just between the EV makers, right? Just between cafes in China, just between handphone shops in China, the amount of micro innovation, the amount of insanity business goes on there is really remarkable. So Chinese companies, in a sense, they're devouring themselves. And as the world, sure, maybe you don't want to go into China and play the Hunger Games with them, but you'll get to enjoy the fruits of their labor, of their hardship. Prices keeps going down, and you can actually use some of this technology to boost your own economy up. So let's just use Europe, for example, right? We know that they have an energy crisis. I mean, by now everyone knows. Germany's power prices has gone up over the last 6 months, almost double, 50% to double. That's insane. And we know Europe themselves, they have self-imposed themselves into a very diplomatic and economic box. They are so-called not allowed to buy cheap Russian gas. In this case, who can help them? China. Get cheap solar panels in, build up your own renewable resources, stop all these tariffs on especially this kind of renewable power, and use what China is good for. Use them to benefit your own economy, and then everyone can live harmoniously. So when it comes to this idea of overcapacity, it's how you really want to play your cards.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good insight. And I love how you said that China is exporting deflation to the world because of the way that this uber competition in China. And I think that's one insight I want to share with our viewers here is you hit on this very clearly. And I love that, don't just think about the EVs, it's anything, even from cafes to restaurants to the cell phone shops. I mean, there's intense competition in China, and really only the cream rises to the top, as we say, only the best of the best are going to be able to survive. As a case study for that EV industry, at one point, China had over 100 different EV car makers, and they're all competing with each other. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that the most intense EV rivalry is probably between Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And, you have a very similar thing, in what happens is you have these provinces, the inter-province rivalry is very intense. And so you can start with 100 EVs, 90 of them are going to fail because they just can't make it within their own country. And all of a sudden, you get a case study like BYD, who has risen to the top and is the number one EV in China. And now they're starting to really export their model. And they're so battle tested, right? They've been able to survive that intense domestic rivalry in China. Well, now they're able to go and really dominate on the international stage because, quite frankly, it's a lot easier, right? Once you've been able to get to the top in China, exporting to Europe and South America, relatively easy, all things considered. Let's talk more about this with the innovation. I want to get your thoughts on what do you think about DeepSeek and how and the AI industry. And when obviously 1 month ago we've seen DeepSeek make its debut, completely revolutionize the future of AI. Share with us your thoughts.
Yeah, but I think this was a very big rude wake-up call for the West, right? Because we have seen over the entire last 3 to 4 years, in fact, a lot of tech companies, Nvidia, you're talking about Meta, talking about Google, they've been piling on hundreds of billions of dollars to build up all this tech infrastructure in a way that they want to build the hardest, the fastest, and the most powerful AI out there. Their own version of Skynet. However, China just came in and they came up with a more elegant solution. And this solution was essentially the birth child of all the sanctions being hammered on them, the multiple chips restrictions, not being able to get latest NVIDIA chips. So they came out with their software workaround, which actually allowed you to accomplish quite a bit of AI tasks at a high level without having all the major chips out there. So if we look at the past 24 hours itself, NVIDIA lost a lot of market cap. Their stocks just totally crashed.
Right.
And that's because China has shown that you don't need to spend so much money to brute force your way out of it. There's always a simpler innovation out there. And I want to touch a bit more about China's ecosystem as well and how they're combining all these technologies together. I think a week ago, I saw an article, I think it was on the FT or South China Morning Post or something. It was about, I think, BYD using DeepSeek to create their full self-driving mechanism called the God's Eye or something. And I was so shocked about it. The speed of innovation in China is breathtaking. DeepSeek comes out and you just give it less than a month. The major car company in the world, they're going to integrate it there. And it just creates more competition for every other EV brand out there, whether it's Volkswagen, whether it's Tesla, and it's going to be very hard for them to compete, which brings us to another issue that I have. Right now, we are seeing many G7 members out there of the Western Club. They are saying that you shouldn't use DeepSeek because of data collection or the data goes to CCP or something. But I mean, if you use other solutions like ChatGPT, if the NSA wants to know what you're researching on, you'll get it.
Yeah.
So in a sense, they're just they're disadvantaging their own economies because they have an inherent certain bias against China. So I think this is not a very good feedback loop for them.
Yeah, no, I think I think what's really interesting as well is we're at a point right now in society where anything coming from China is deemed a national security threat, right? So as soon as we saw DeepSeek come out, obviously, many of the far right-wing politicians immediately said, hey, this is once again going to be another national security threat. And I think that's just another, almost a code language for, we can't compete. We've just been beaten. And so it's amazing kind of this hysteria that has taken over Washington. And but what I really like about that, Sean, is I like the fact that we've seen a lot of industry experts, really the most advanced minds in Silicon Valley have come out and said, this is an incredible gift to the world. I mean, this is really, truly open source. Again, it's something that's going to be benefiting everyone. I saw another interesting graph shared by a researcher, I believe his name is Kyle Chan, who showed this ecosystem of innovation. And it was quite fascinating because it just showed you how all of the different industries are connecting. And I think that's one thing that you see as well. For example, Huawei. Huawei is known for making cell phones and mobile technology. Well, now they're partnering with auto brands in China to be able to advance that technology. So you're seeing a lot of synergies between different industries, a lot of companies working together for the greater good of the country. It's a very interesting thing that happens in China, and that's something I really want our viewers to know. Obviously, you and I have had the great fortune to travel to China and experience that. And obviously, you live full time in Asia, so we're a lot more used to these innovations in the technology. Not as much here in the United States, where we're still working on that. Not as fast forward, in developing. Quite frankly, as our Asian counterparts.
Yes, and if we look at the landscape and how it's evolving, right, it's getting quite funny, stunning, and brutal at the same time. So what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
I think just 2 weeks ago, you had an announcement from Apple that they're going to partner with Alibaba's AI to create, new iPhone solutions that can only be sold in China. So we are starting to see this big divide in technology. Even Western brands, they realize that Apple, why do I want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build up AI and compete with all the other magnificent seven out there?
Right.
Complete waste of money, right? Why don't I just tap onto China's expertise, create my own solution, and then sell it to one of the biggest growing markets out there that might even exceed the United States one day? But as a result of this, what did Trump come out over the last 2 to 3 days? He came out with an executive, I'm not so sure whether it was an order or recommendation that US companies shouldn't invest into technologies by Chinese companies. So we're already beginning to see a form of financial iron curtain coming up between the United States and China. And if this continues, if this accelerates into other forms of industries, the risk is that the US economy might get isolated more and more from cheaper innovation, cheaper technologies, while the cost of production in everything in the US just keeps going up. And I don't think that's exactly beneficial as well.
No, I think you're spot on. And, Sean, I want to talk to you a little bit about gold, because I think this is an interesting segue here, because I know that you're a very astute gold investor, a lot of experience, a lot of great videos on your YouTube channel about investing in gold. I want to get your thoughts as we're going into, obviously we're now into 2025, and
Right.
we got a new president in the United States, and, kind of as you're forecasting and looking forward to the future, what are you expecting in the gold industry this year? And for those that are interested in investing, kind of how are you analyzing the future of the market and these geopolitics and specifically in relation to gold?
Sure. I think the first thing we need to touch on is the massive price rally over the last 1 to 2 years, really, right? In less than 12 months, gold was like $1,800, and now we are about to crack 3,000.
Right.
Of course, when prices go on such a big run up, you tend to be quite careful, and nothing ever moves in a straight line. But if we look at the entire global situation, the amount of drivers, demand for gold, I would say over the next 5 to 10 years is still going to be bullish, right?
Right.
Let's firstly talk about the dollar sanctions, as well as the US not being able to control their fiscal spending. I think these are two very big drivers for the price of gold. At the end of the day, there are very few assets out there that is not within America's direct jurisdiction. If you have stocks in a brokerage account, worst comes to worst, the US can always take it away. They can always find out where you have your assets. However, gold is very private. It's very secret, and, it's locked up in the vaults. There's even, conspiracy theories about America having zero gold. That's why Trump wants to go in.
Right.
And there's so much hoo-ha about it because gold is truly a store of value. If we shift our focus to China, we can see they're actually moving a lot of money into gold for a variety of reasons.
Right.
So let's quickly talk about the government side. It's no secret that China's deleveraging their US bond holdings. And for that, they have to find other places to store their wealth, right? As much as China likes to invest in a BRI, not every project is a great project to pile your money into, right? You still need to recover your money at the end of the day. And how much subsidies can you give your own country without being accused of, you're the great overcapacity producer on planet Earth.
Right.
So you need to take some money and store it into assets. Well, do you really want to fund the US government by buying treasury bonds after they're doing so much things to you? Not really. So you'll put it into gold. And if we look at the amount of gold holdings China has versus the US, we can see it's like 3 to 4 times the difference. The US is more, at least on the official charts. But at least to me, I don't really believe it because China is the world's biggest gold producer. That's one. And there's a lot of strict restrictions from physical gold living out of China. It's easy. It's a Hotel California, right? It's easy to come in. Gold can come in, but it's hard to come out. So all the numbers are not really adding up, which begs the question, what is China actually planning?
Right.
It's just on the government side. Now let's talk about regular average Joes, you and me. Let's say we're living in China. Why do they buy gold? Now, this is a combination of reasons. Now, firstly, in Asian cultures, including in Singapore, India, China, gold is basically true wealth, right? We've seen it around and it holds value for generations. So there's already an embedded culture in that as well.
Right.
But if we look at the situation of China and property collapse over the last 2 years, which I think is bottoming out right now,
Correct.
households really don't have much avenues to pile their money into, right? A lot of money has been put into Chinese bonds. That's why the bond yield has been going down. But frankly, you're only getting like 1-2%. It's not much, right?
Right.
And putting your money to property when confidence is so low might not really be a solution if prices keeps going down. The Chinese government is trying to stabilize it, but you don't know whether it'll be done next month or next year.
Right.
So a lot of young people, a lot of working executives, they don't really have much of a choice but to put their money into gold. It's a place of last resort. And that's why we are seeing a lot of countries, especially emerging economies like China as well, they are just stockpiling more to gold. So as this situation continues to evolve, if Trump continues persecuting his trade war, this is not good for the dollar. And unfortunately, it's good for gold, or maybe fortunately, it's good for gold.
Right. Yeah. I think I think gold is a very interesting asset to hold. I mean, I'm certainly very bullish on gold myself. I do think it is a great storage of wealth, and I think we have this amazing relationship with the tariffs and the trade war and the dollar and how that's going. And Sean, I think today has been such an amazing conversation because I love inviting smart people that are smarter than me, that can come in and really educate us. And I really love your YouTube channel. I want to get one last question here, though, before we end this. And that is, I'd like to get your thoughts on, looking forward. You're someone that studies the markets, and what are you really expecting for the U.S. economy specifically in the next 6 to 12 months? If you could give, your best guess as to that. I mean, do you think that this combination of Trump's politics and his economic policies, is this going to basically result in higher inflation, higher interest rates, and really a tougher economic times ahead? Or do you feel the opposite? Do you feel that it's, Trump's going to be able to make America great again?
Whoa, this is a tough one. I mean, it really depends on how Trump really goes, right? Does he go pedal to the metal?
Right.
So let's just use the base case. Right now, we are beginning to see China starting to retaliate. China's not going down without a fight.
Right.
Trump is also using a lot of harsh measures, telling Mexico, you better punish China or else we'll punish you. And how far will this rabbit hole go? Will he go to Vietnam? Will it go to EU with the same demand? Because if it does, if the whole world starts tariffing each other and everything gets into one complex mess, inflation will go up.
Right.
Interest rates will go up. The US and many economies out there, they are basically a function of interest rates and inflation. Interest rates goes too high, consumption goes down, people buy less houses, mortgage defaults, credit cards basically implode. So we could be in a situation where, I hate to say it could be a recession as well.
Right.
Then we look at what Trump is actually doing with Doge as well, is firing a lot of federal workers, which I can understand there's a lot of wastage out there, right? Look at some of the policies. Well, you're spending money on this, you're spending money on that. Even I'm rubbing my eyes.
Right.
But how far can you go along with it, right? And as the interest rates continue to stay high, this pushes up the national debt as well. So there's so many complicated parts that I think Trump understands, but maybe he's not fully appreciating as well. Now, there are some bright spots in the economy out there which might actually help the world or help their own economies and not affect the United States. Okay, one great example is China's stimulus. In the past, in 2008, when the property bubble collapsed, China actually came in and so-called save the world in a sense, right? They bought a lot of US debt.
That's
and
right.
they blew up their own property bubble as well. But now we are seeing a very weird decoupling between the Chinese markets, the Chinese economy, and the US economy. So just think about it. Even if China does a stimulus, President Xi launches 10, 20 trillion yuan worth of stimulus, what are the odds he's going to go out there and encourage people to buy US products? I think it's close to none.
Correct.
And even people in China, and I'm sure you might have seen instances of this where there's a bit of a nationalistic buying going on. Let's support local brands. Let's buy more Luckin coffee, maybe lay off the Starbucks for a while.
Correct.
So this kind of things is happening. And just yesterday, the last 24 hours, we saw something quite amazing. As the US stock market started to go down, S&P 500 dropped quite a bit. China's stocks were resilient.
Right.
They hardly moved. We are entering a world of true economic decoupling that we have not seen for the last 20 to 30 years. And how Trump plays this, it's going to be tough. He's either going to make the situation worse or at least maintain a slow implosion rate until somehow the United States gets back on their feet.
Yeah, but what a great answer, Sean. That is fantastic. I think, we're going to end it there for today. And I just want to say thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and on your YouTube channel. And everybody, if you've made it to this point of the video, I just want to say thank you for giving us your time today. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with me and Sean. And Sean, I'll give you the final word. Where can we follow you? I know you're on YouTube. Anywhere else that we can follow you? How can people follow your amazing content?
Sure. Right now, I'm just on YouTube. So just go search up Sean Foo Go. Just type my name, Sean Foo. Chances are I'll be on the search. And we cover geopolitics, but mainly more towards the finance side, economics, and of course, gold. And thanks, Cyrus, for having me today. It was a blast. And yeah, I hope to come again sometime soon.
That sounds great, Sean. Fantastic. And I'm looking forward. I'm going to go be back in your home country of Singapore this September. So maybe get a chance to meet in person and maybe even record some videos together. That'd be great.
Sure. We can do one of your, famous walkabouts and just film.
That sounds great. Awesome. Well, everybody, thank you again for your support today. We're going to put those links down in the description and we'll see you all in our next video soon.